How's it going there, everybody? So I have done a number of videos on my thoughts about the liturgical disputes, wars, discussions, however you want to phrase it, going on within the Catholic Church. And I've attempted the last few episodes that I've engaged that topic to do my best to look at both sides or all sides in as detached of a way that I can. But I have not, I think, sufficiently given my own personal opinion on the matter at the moment. Okay. So, for what it's worth, that's what this episode is going to be about, is basically giving you my personal opinion on the Liturgy Wars as it is at present. Today is the last day of February 28th, 2023. So this will basically be my views as of that date. Okay. So I really kind of wrestle with the tensions between what I see as the aesthetical problems with the Novus Ordo as opposed to the traditional Latin Mass, or more technically the Missal of 1962. I do find the Missal of 1962 to be much more aesthetically pleasing. Because of that, theologically more coherent. I think it much more adequately, in my view, expresses Catholic theology than does the Missal of 1969, also known as the Novus Ordo. Okay. So that's basically throwing out my opinion there. Now, why do I have that opinion, and then what's the opposite tension that kind of I'm wrestling with here? Real quick, it would be my reason for having that opinion is that I do think that the Novus Ordo, the Missal of 1969, gives way too much freedom in the rubric for the individual priest and for the laity. I think that there is an incredible amount of confusion that can go on because of the way the rubrics are laid out in the 1969 Missal. Okay. I also have a bone to pick with certain parts of the general instruction of the Roman Missal for the 1969, commonly known as the GIRM. Okay. I think it, at least in the versions of it I've read, and I can't remember if those are the most up-to-date versions or not, but at least in the versions of it that I've read, it definitely seemed to overemphasize the supper aspect of the liturgy over the sacrifice aspect of the liturgy. And I think that is problematic when it is compared with Catholic theology, particularly the theology as given to us in the Council of Trent on the issue of the sacrificial nature of the liturgy. Okay. Of course, the liturgy is both a supper and a sacrifice, but I think when we make the emphasis on the supper, I think that problems arise. The nature of the Mass, I think, becomes inverted when we do that. It is a supper, yes, but it seems to me that the theology laid down for us in the Council of Trent would say that the supper is subservient to the sacrifice in our theology of the liturgy. Okay, so that's kind of some thoughts just on the germ. But then, kind of at root with the Missal of 1969, the Novus Ordo, my biggest problem with it is that it gives too much freedom to the individual celebrant and to the laity. And it has breeded an immense amount of confusion as to how the liturgy is to be celebrated. I think that would be my chief concern with the Novus Ordo. Okay. My other concern for it would be the way in which it was promulgated initially. Like, I would definitely agree with Pope Benedict XVI in his analysis in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, where he basically says that the 1969 Missal was put together in the way of like how an industrialist would, where things are just kind of cobbled together. Pieces of various liturgies from history are kind of taken and they're kind of like thrown together in a pot and out comes the Novus Ordo. Okay. And I mean, that's obviously an overly simplistic view of the situation and the history there. But particularly as I've been going through Annibale Bugnini's memoir, it really, that does seem to be the general arc of the history, is that it really did seem like, even from Annibale Bugnini, who was the secretary of the Concillium, the sort of the group of people who formulated the Novus Ordo, okay, in his own memoir, it really becomes clear through my reading of it that the Novus Ordo was basically cobbled together from a bunch of historical liturgies, and they kind of just took different pieces from different histories and like added them together. And most of it came from the Roman Rite, the 1962 Missal and previous missals to it. Most of it did come from there, but they also just took a bunch of things from various different liturgies or scraps of different liturgies that we have evidence of throughout history. And there really was not an organic development. There really wasn't. There was no organic development with what happened with the 1969 Missal. It was, like I said, it kind of just cobbled together by a committee of people known as the Concillium over the course of about 4 years, and was then presented, approved by the Pope, and voila, we have the 1969 Missal. I mean, again, like I said, that's an overly simplistic view of what happened, but I think it is kind of an accurate view, unfortunately. And I think that for that reason, not that the origins of the liturgy necessarily mean that the liturgy itself is like inherently wrong or something, or bad. Of course not, I wouldn't say that. But I think it is evident that at least from an aesthetical point of view, that the 1969 liturgy is kind of like a chimera, which is a mythical creature that's kind of like, I think it has the head of a, if I'm remembering correctly, it has the head of a lion, and like the body of a dragon, and like the tail of a snake or something like that, and the wings of an eagle, I think, also. And it has like lots of different legs. It's kind of weird. Anyway, but it's kind of, the Novus Ordo is kind of this like piecemeal liturgy that was kind of put into this like factory of the Concillium, and they kind of said, oh, we're just going to take this from, the 3rd century, whatever it would be, the 4th century liturgy, and this from the 8th century, and this from the Byzantines, and this from the Coptics, and this from the blah, 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 whatever it is. And they just kind of pieced it together, with the majority of it being from the Roman Rite. And this factory, for the analogy, called the Concillium, spewed out this liturgy that really has no roots, from at least an aesthetical point of view. And what Ratzinger does is he compares it again to an industrialist, as opposed to what the church should have done, in his opinion, which would have been to have the view of a gardener towards the liturgy. And in Ratzinger's view, in the spirit of the liturgy, that was the mentality of a gardener is what the church had really up until the 1969 Missal. Now, of course, there are different historical anomalies here and there of changes that were made, and there were abrupt changes at times, but they were small changes, is the thing. And I think that there is a difference that is very plain to see between the Missal of 1962 and the Missal of 1969. Okay. And I think that kind of a difference, as far as I can tell, is novel in history. Okay. Now, what am I saying here? I'm saying from an aesthetical point of view, aesthetical, I think, is the correct pronunciation. Aesthetical, okay? Because aesthetical is like the philosophy of beauty, right? How we understand beauty, whereas aesthetical, without kind of the TH sound in there, would be like a penitential kind of a person, okay? The words are very closely related, and it's kind of hard to maybe hear the difference there. But I'm meaning aesthetic in the term of philosophy of beauty, okay? And these aesthetical differences that I see between the 1969 and the 1962 Missals, I think are very important to understand for the sake of getting back to a liturgy that is connected organically to its roots. Okay. Now, what am I not saying? People might misinterpret me. I'm not saying that the Missal of 1969 is inherently evil. I'm not saying that the Missal of 1969 is invalid. I'm not even saying that the Missal of 1969 is illicit or unlawful. Okay. It's clearly been promulgated by a legitimate pope and was, like I said, cobbled together by a council of people who were delegated by the Pope, okay? But I guess what I'm trying to say is my criticism of the Novus Ordo, the Missal of 1969, is of an ascetical nature, not of a more inherent nature, okay? I'm not attacking the Novus Ordo in and of itself in the sense of I think it in and of itself is wrong or you shouldn't go to it. I'm not saying that, of course not. I attend the Novus Ordo virtually every Sunday. There's a few Sundays a year when I'll go to the Byzantine liturgy. There's a few Sundays a year where I'll go to the traditional Latin Mass. Okay, but virtually every Sunday during the year, I attend the Novus Ordo, and I have no problems with that. Now, what I wish to see happen is to get more and more aesthetically pleasing and aesthetically coherent liturgies with the Novus Ordo. And I do think the Novus Ordo, because of that drawback of it offering too much freedom, I think that drawback is also a strength in it, in the sense that if we kind of get our act together as a church, I'm particularly concerned with my own diocese, okay? The place where I have the most chance of making an impact, okay? I think because of that freedom, we can basically make the Novus Ordo as close as possible to the traditional Latin Mass. And in my view, it would not be so that we could stay there in the Novus Ordo. I think it would be so that we could get to another edition of the Missal, maybe the Missal of 2050 or the Missal of 2100. I don't know what it would be, but where they said the Pope and people he's delegated would say, hey, you know what? The Missal of 1969, it's really not very coherent with what came before, and we want to try to make a liturgy that's a lot more coherent with the 1962, okay, and with the Roman Rite as it had existed throughout history until then. And I'm dreaming here, okay? I'm dreaming here, but sometimes saying what our ideal situation is helpful because it shows what we're striving for and where we're coming from, all right? So even if this never happens, I think it is valuable to at least speak into existence, okay? And so, maybe in 2100, whatever it is, the Pope or, the Vatican promulgates a liturgy that is very, very much in line with the 1962 and, the Roman Rite as it had been known before then, maybe with some minor changes to what Sacrosanctum Concillium called for, I would consider when Sacrosanctum Concillium, which is Vatican II's document on the liturgy, for those who don't know, talks about active participation. What it means, and I'm really taking this from Benedict XVI, what it means is mostly an interior participation, being active, right? We're not just sitting there praying the rosary. We're actually attentive to what's going on at the Mass. But then maybe a practical point would be to say, well, the people, the laity at the Mass would then say the responses that the server would say in the 1962 Missal, okay? And to my knowledge, the evolution to where the server was the only one giving responses was actually a pretty late kind of innovation in the Roman Rite. If I'm correct, the Tridentine Mass, okay, the Missal of 1570, as promulgated by Pius V, if I'm correct, I don't believe that the responses were limited to the server alone. I believe the people would give those few responses as well. And I really think that that's what the Fathers of Vatican II were trying to get at when they were talking about active participation. It was making an internal active participation, right? But then also maybe external active participation in the sense of returning those responses that the server would say to the general congregation. All right. So, that is something that I think would make the 1962 Missal much more in conformity with Sacrosanctum Concillium, but yet keep its continuity with the past. Okay. And then the other thing would be, I think that there can be a case made for the vernacular in certain regions. Okay, and I really do think that this was the intent of many of the fathers at Vatican II, was that it would be an allowance for the vernacular in certain regions, not everywhere. I don't think that was the intent. I think it was to give the decision up to the episcopal conferences, the bishops' conferences in each region, and those that really needed it would take it. Okay, because there are certain areas of the world, you can think of like tribes in the middle of the Amazon desert, or the Amazon rainforest, for example. Like, they have zero connection with Western culture. Now, they could, of course, be Westernized, right? But it may be necessary for a time, and maybe for a long time, for them to have a liturgy that is basically the traditional Latin Mass, but in the vernacular. And that may be necessary for a time. And then, potentially, if the culture became more and more Westernized, which maybe is something to shoot for, maybe it's not, I don't know. That's kind of an open question for me. Then at that point, then it would be like, okay, well, now we'll go to Latin because people are receptive to that. Okay. I think this is something that we've actually seen in the past. There was I believe it was the Iroquois in the 1700s, I believe. The Vatican gave or created a particular missal, a version of the Roman Rite that was like applicable to the Native Americans in North America, and probably also it was probably also meant for maybe other regions too. But I believe it was the Iroquois in particular that this missal was made for, and to my knowledge, this missal was translated into the vernacular of the Iroquois nation. Okay, the Iroquois Native Americans, to my knowledge. So I think that's a really good example of maybe what the Fathers of Vatican II were thinking when Sacrosanctum Concillium was promulgated. All right, and even if it wasn't what they were thinking, I believe that there's a really good argument to be made that most of what's in Sacrosanctum Concillium, is reformable. I don't think much of it, if any of it, is a matter of faith and morals. And, and I think that a lot of it can be kind of reworded or interpreted in a way that is in much greater continuity with what came before. I'm not the kind of person that would say that Vatican II or Sacrosanctum Concillium puts a real stumbling block to our faith. I think that we should always interpret documents of the church in continuity with the tradition of the church, and her practice, and her faith throughout history. And we should really only assume a continuity of rupture when it really makes itself clear. Okay. And I think I am one of those people that would say that the Novus Ordo, I do think that there is a continuity of rupture there, aesthetically speaking. Okay. Not in any sort of inherent way. All right. So that's kind of where I stand on it. I'm willing to be critiqued on this. It's kind of a work in progress. The other thing real quick is that I think that there's a lot of tension on the traditionalist side with the Magisterium, and mainly how the Magisterium has functioned over the last 60 years since the Second Vatican Council, and since a little bit before it as well. I think there's a lot of tension there that needs to be resolved, particularly on the traditionalist side. And I'm thinking mainly of how we understand papal authority, how we understand the authority of an ecumenical council, all this stuff. I do think that there are a lot of traditionalist Catholics out there who are, maybe they just don't know, how the magisterium works. And I don't blame them. It's a really complex subject. I don't claim to know everything about it. I've made mistakes in conversations that I've had with people about it. And also, like, not everything has been totally worked out yet as regards how we understand the magisterium. A lot of it has, I think, particularly with Vatican II. Vatican II helped a lot with things like Dei Verbum 10 and Lumen Gentium 25, Lumen Gentium 12, all that kind of fun stuff. But I do think there are still some things that are open questions. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So anyway, I might do a second video on this. We'll see. But yeah, that's it. Thanks.